James Pogue,
Hello.
what's up? We were just talking on WhatsApp, but figured we would just start the pod from here. Um, for people who don't know James's work, he's a journalist who's written a bunch of bangers, but maybe the most famous is like a Vanity Fair piece about the new right with Curtis Yarvin, Glenn Greenwald, Jeff Bezos. All these heavy hitters weighed in. And I think a lot of people would say it is one of the fairest and most balanced pieces about that kind of political lean. But I like your writing, James, because you just get the fuck out there, which I'm about. And right now you're in Mauritania, so it doesn't get any more legit than that.
Well, close to Mauritania. I'm in Burkina Faso, but yes. Um,
Oh, you're in
w-
Burkina Faso.
um, but thank you. But thank you for all of that, and I'm glad to be here. I'm excited.
What is the scene in Burkina Faso right now? What are you doing there?
So, yeah, this was maybe confusing when we were talking about WhatsApp earlier. I just left Mauritania, and then went for a couple sort of days of respite to Dakar, which is like the only truly sane, which is in Senegal, and it's the only kind of like truly
Mm-hmm.
sane country in this region right now. And then now I'm in Ouagadougou, which is the capital of Burkina, which is a very flat, very hot country, landlocked country in the middle of the Sahel. Um, and like everywhere around here right now, it's kind of there's this swelling insurgency being largely driven by, well, excuse me, it's hard to say who it's been driven by, uh, but it's sort of mingled in a semi-ethnic conflict that involves this people called the Peul, Pular. Um, uh, some people know them as Fulani, although Fulani, in the West, we always get Fulani confused with Pul. That's actually a subset of the Puls. Anglophones like never really understand what's going on around here. Long story short, the war and the Islamist insurgency that really kicked off in 2012, and we can go into that history because it's interesting and not all what you would think of as Islamic insurgency. It has gotten a lot worse in Mali, Burkina, and Niger in the last 3 years. And as it has gotten worse, the role of Russia has gotten much greater in those three countries, especially. And so now Russia has security agreements with all three countries. All three countries have undergone an anti French, vaguely left wing, vaguely, people use the word souverainiste, sovereigntist coup that has led them to become much more pro Russia. And so right now in Burkina, you basically can't leave the capital without there being some risk of safety issues. And the south is still pretty safe, but like the north, especially the north, the east, and even down near the border with Ghana is like super, super dangerous now, which is, even people who don't really follow Africa tend, probably know that Ghana has historically been super, super safe, super fine. Even that's not really true anymore. So I came here to kind of report on the stew of intrigue that is France getting thrown out, Russia kind of moving in, but it's not really official here the way it is in Mali. Uh, the kind of like jihadist element, the ethnic element. Um, that's a long answer, but that's what I'm doing here. And then it's completely fine in the capital. You can walk around, no problem.
I know in 2013 when there was like a jihadist uprising in Mali, the French came and they kind of quashed it. But now it seems like the French have withdrawn and Russia is the one that's like stabilizing everything.
So basically, you're right. You know, to the extent to which it's interesting to anybody, that story is super crazy, and it's much more complicated than it having been an Islamist insurgency because what actually kicked off everything in 2012 was a Tuareg rebellion.
Right.
The Tuareg people being these sort of camel herding nomads with no country, which every time you look at a war, we can talk about this too. Like every time you look at a war, in this part of the world, it's because somebody drew a line in the sand that was the wrong place to have drawn the line. And that's as true in Rwanda, cutting Congolese Tutsis off from Rwandese Tutsis to the Tuaregs, to in fact, the Poles, who are divided like the Kurds between like 6 different countries. And when you divide nomadic people around in 6 different countries, they move around, it causes problems. Uh, but the Tuaregs, even people who don't follow this stuff probably know they're just like super, super cool. They have cool stuff. They have a cool lifestyle. They're cowboy motherfuckers, right? And they have turbans that they wear that the indigo dyes their faces blue after many years, and they carry swords, and they're legendary warriors and traders and historically slavers as
And they
well.
play electric guitars really loud in the desert.
Yeah, exactly. So people probably know like that band Tina Cohen, which is super good. Um, and so, not I'm not Tuareg politics is like for a nation of like 12 people, it's flabbergastingly complicated because like all 12 men in the entire Tuareg world, like all of them have a different militia and a different set of changing alliances, and it's impossible even in French to follow, honestly. Like, and there's like WhatsApp groups who just like Tuareg, like Azawad, because that's the Azawad is like the Berber. Tuareg speak a Berber derived language. um and so you can like try to follow Azawad politics, and unless you do it for a living and speak Arabic and speak like you're not always going to know what's going on. But the long story short is that in there had been a Tuareg rebellion periodically in Mali for many years, because the north of Mali is, if not largely Tuareg, it's been politically dominated by Tuaregs since independence. And so that kicked off like in 1960. There was immediately rebellion, um, and centered around this kind of mythical city of Kidal, which has periodically been independent from Malian government control. Uh, and there was another war. All of these people were always backed by Gaddafi and trained in Libya.
Hmm.
They were often restrained by Libya. This is kind of the thing, is they were put out to do stuff with Libyan backing, and then Libya would pull back when Gaddafi was trying to make nice with France. When Gaddafi was not trying to make nice with France, things would get different. This happened in, I think, 92 or 94. I'm not sure, but there was a big war in 92 or 94. And then in 2012, you had the kind of thing where it jumped the shark, where this guy, Agyad Gali, who was a major figure in various Tuareg rebellions over the years, joined forces with what became known as Al Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb and swept out of the traditional Tuareg regions. And he basically went rogue. The Tuaregs were like, this is cool. Like, we kind of got what we wanted. Gaddafi's dead. We have all these weapons now. There's nobody restraining it. It unleashed forces across the Sahel, and they swept down. And then he was like, we're going to Bamako, the capital, which is in the center. It's historically, black African as opposed to Arabu Belbel. And this was kind of like, this was never on the table for most Tuareg, even like the most rebel minded. This was never the plan. Um, but along with Al Qaeda and Islamic Maghreb, they were like, we're going to get to Bamako and institute Sharia in Mali, which is a country that's 85% Muslim, but also largely animist, and has, you can buy booze, there's clubs, it's always been a tourist country. It's not a Sharia style place. Um, and they were very successful until, yeah, the French came in. Uh, but, I'm trying to think of the numbers here. The French never sent that many people. I'm so you had the air raid. They basically found these convoys in the desert heading towards Bamako, and blew the shit out of them. And then uh, after everyone retreated back into the massifs in the north of Mali into the Sahara, they waged this siege where they killed tons and tons of fighters.
I remember reading that the French pioneered like a way of combating RPGs with helicopters, where they would fly really low to the ground and kind of like blow past caves and be able to like skirt the RPG fire That's a kind of way that they were able to push the insurgents back.
Interesting. I actually didn't know that. Yeah, and I mean, you had to kind of do that because you were, this was the grand, we can get into this, but this was like this sort of grand era of counterinsurgency, imperial police style militaries where the role of militaries, and this has perhaps been true even more of France than the United States in the last 50 years, but like the role of militaries is to go and waste a bunch of poorly armed people who violate kind of whatever norm you've decided they're violating. And it's not to take and hold territory. It's not, it's, we can get into that stuff. But, you know, uh, the north of Mali is huge. And you're trying to control a space the size of Afghanistan. They had like 5,000 guys there at the peak, I think. And like by the end, I think it was like 2,000. And it just wasn't a very effective, it wasn't a very effective mode of fighting. And so you went in the space of 10 years, a little less, from people on the streets of Bamako waving French flags, and largely speaking, throughout the region, people being, if not pro-French per se, being accustomed to the idea that France is the indispensable partner of this region, and that you live with France, your political energies are directed towards France. It's hard to have a president of a country who's not at least tacitly approved by the French government. Um, and you went from that to now, like you can't, a French person can't get a visa to go to Mali. They rip up French flags and to resew them into Russian flags. Um, and
Wow.
Wagner, yeah, it's really crazy to see. You'll see that on the streets. You'll see that on the streets of Ouagadougou. And uh, basically, I mean, the big deal with Mali is that they people in Mali came to the conclusion, right or wrong, that France was tacitly supporting a northern region that was going to be autonomous for the Tuaregs. And it's hard to say whether that was really true, but it is definitely true that despite the fact that France was there, the Malian government did not have control of the north. Um, and Kidal remained very much under the control of the Azawadi groups. Uh, and then Russia came in um, after a coup, after essentially an anti-French coup, and that all of these coups have been led by young, low-ranking officers. So here it's Captain Traore. In Mali, I think he was a colonel or also a captain. But there are people who worked in special anti-terrorism operations generally. So there were in Niger. It was actually the head of the presidential guard. But all people were like highly trained in elite units, but are relatively low ranking who led military coups against largely French-backed, French-friendly, Western-friendly people. Um, and shortly after that coup, they asked they asked France to leave. They have a contract with Wagner that is largely paid for by gold mining revenue. And Wagner in Mali has been just absolutely horrific. And they have a lot of they've get both the Malian army now, the and Wagner. They have drones, they have air power. Wagner has a few attack helicopters there, and they will largely pull villages. They are just ethnically cleansing right now, and they'll go and Um, they'll take all the men over a certain age and kill them. Um, a lot of there's like I was talking to the UN on the Mauritanian side of the border, and they're saying 7,000 people a day are fleeing across the border right now. Um, I met this family in Mali where it was a kid not older than 14 or something, and he was like, I'm the only man in the family, we came here to work, because they're scared of Malian intelligence coming and killing their relatives in Mali if they talk. So he was like, oh yeah, nothing happened, we just came here for work. And his eyes had been burned out, and there were no men in his family, and it was him and 17 women. And he's just like lying to us, of course, he's terrified. uh and that's like very common with Pole. You'll talk to people. I was riding with these camel soldiers, along the border, and like these are Mauritanians. Like his uncle like crossed the border with some cows and got drone struck, got killed. 40 people got, and then an attack helicopter came. 40 people died, and nobody talks about this. Nobody's like has really paid any attention to this stuff. Because it's really hard to work as a journalist in Mali right now. Uh, you can't get out of Bamako; it's too dangerous. Um, but it's very effective. Like the Russian assault has been very effective. It has turned the Malian armed forces around. The Malian armed forces have become, if not more professional, then definitely more brutal. And so they finally, it's this huge deal, but finally, after however many years, they swept unopposed into Kidal. Um, and the Wagner guys got there first. And so over the historic fort in Kidal, which is like this iconic symbol of Tuareg resistance, the Wagner skull flag flew for a while. And then it was like this huge international incident. Everybody's like, take that the fuck down, take that down, take that down. This is a huge problem. So it got hauled down, but a few people got a picture of it. So it's become this real kind of like symbol of Russia and Africa now. It's like the Wagner death head flying over the fort at Kidal. Um, because it symbolizes both the brutality but also the effectiveness of what these guys are doing. Um, and so I've been kind of like tracing that whole story throughout the region, but it's very hard because you can't really do anything. You can't tell anyone you're reporting. Um,
Kidal is close to Timbuktu.
it depends on how you define close. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I
it's
mean, but they're both northern Mali, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, it's probably an ungodly far drive.
And what about your time in Central African Republic? That's a place that not a lot of journalists have access to.
So I first went to the Central African Republic, to
Hmm.
Bangui, and Bangui. So the Bangui airport is the Russian logistics base for all of this stuff. Um, and the Central African Republic is just a different, even than these like titularly pro-Russian places. Like the Central African Republic is a completely different beast. Like you go into the immigration office in Bangui, and there's like a Chechen dude with tattoos who's just like chilling, watching the events. Like they control ministries. Like from there, they have a guy who just will look in and be like, "Are you doing this the way I want you to be doing it?" And everybody knows that.
So they're completely interwoven into the government, or
Yes,
kind of
yes,
what is a government. I mean,
they
it's
are
kind
a
of a
hundred
gray
percent.
area at this point.
They are a part of the government. I mean, they run a radio station there. They're a part of the fabric of society, and there's not that many of them. Um, I don't want to give a number because I don't actually know. Um, there's not that many of them, but there's guys who are just like there who's like, the main guy is this guy Dimitri Sihi, uh, who's a Wagner dude who held over after the kind of Wagner. The other thing, I mean, this is really interesting to me. Everybody in Western media like consistently describes Wagner as an organization that has disappeared, that with the leadership was decapitated, they did their rebellion, there was this whole, now it's gone. You will never once in Africa hear anyone refer to anyone in any of these Russian networks of private military companies and taking over mines, taking over governments. You will never hear it referred to as anything but Wagner. um, Even like by diplomats in the U.S. embassy would be like those Wagner guys. Like there's no distinction here. It's still just Wagner. People still wear the patches. Still, people still fly the Wagner flags. So it's very confusing, like what's actually going on. And like Russia now is trying to push this idea of what's going to be called the Africa Corps, which has deliberately kind of, that was what Rommel directed in Nazi Germany's assault on Libya and North Africa. Um, so that like that's a deliberate thing. They're doing that. Uh, but here everything is Wagner, and in car like you will see a government minister go to a hotel to meet with an Indian businessman, and the people accompanying him will be black guys with very new military kit wearing Wagner patches. Like they're just that's like the security elite there. Um,
So they're recruiting people from inside of Car to join Wagner.
oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, and they're not like officially Wagner. They're called like they recruit them actually from the militias. The militia, in frequent cases, from militias uh that Wagner fought and defeated during Carr's civil war. Um, and so there will be guys from the CPC or whatever who now work for Wagner because uh, what's his name? The the um the minister is a guy named Hassan Bouba, who's the minister of what is in French called élevage, which is literally raising up, but is a French word for raising grazing animals, which is like such a cool thing to have a minister for in car. Um, but so because he's a Muslim who came in as a rebel, as most of the Muslims were in 2014, so it's natural that he would be the minister of élevage because Muslims tend to be the ones who are nomadic herders in that region. He's also a Pole, to go back to the earlier thing. The Poles are everywhere in this region, and it's always sort of problems with them that tends to cause wars right now. Long story short, though, like his guys will now be like what literally U.S. embassy officials described to me as Black Russians. They call them, and these would be like militia guys who work with Wagner to do Wagner stuff, but I don't think are like I don't think they're getting Wagner
And so, what are
salary.
the Russians really getting out of this? Like by having so much, Wagner influence in Car, what are they gaining?
Well, so probably not. There's two ways to look at it. So one way is that in terms of just like raw money, like it's a good you're not making a ton of money. I mean, you're making in all of these places. There's been a business model, and the business model is going to be a little different in all of them, but it's not billions upon billions every year. You go to Syria. This is where it was tried first. You go to Syria and you basically say like, yeah, we'll work with you, but you got to give us control of the oil wells, right? And it's actually just like not that hard. Like in my brain, it's fantastically confusing. Like, how do I, a guy who was in the Russian military for 20 years, left, went to jail, became an alcoholic, had two kids, like rejoined this random paramilitary company run by a caterer. How do I know how to take over an oil well? But it's actually just like not that hard to just like tax off the top of a very valuable resource and take it and send money back to Russia. This works, right? But it's not like enriching the Russian state coffers. This is not like a plan to this doesn't compare to like what the Russian oil business is or anything like that. But it
Hmm.
does mean that these military operations are essentially self-funding, which is, as you know, not true of American military operations by any means. Um, and so if you can basically colonize a country for free, it's pretty good, right? Um, the other thing is like as they ramp up, uh, you go from self-funding to like the same thing that Congo was for Belgium back in the day. Like if you have a bunch of very, very valuable resources and you don't have to pay any money to acquire them, then you get rich. I mean, Belgium, like the reason there's a lot of beautiful buildings in Belgium right now is because around the turn of the century, King Leopold just had a bunch of free money because he didn't have to pay for labor and he extracted a bunch of resources. That stuff is true. It's just, it's at the scale of hundreds of millions. It's not at the scale of tens of billions, the way that some resource businesses are. The other trick is like, then once you take over a country, hey, that's 5 million people. It's not a huge country, but Car's 5 million people who now wave Russian flags, might someday teach their kids Russian in schools instead of French, who look to Russia as a major international power. And then you can start, okay, now you have a logistics base. Now your guys, when they fly to Car, like not anymore because now you have your own private flights, but your guys are going to Douala. Your guys are at the border checkpoint. They make a lot of money doing this actually too. They tax people going between Cameroon and Car on the one road based, the one safe road that you can use to transit via land. towards the coast. But now, okay, all these Cameroonians are like, hey, what's up with the Russians? Okay, you just all of a sudden you have a presence on the continent, um, in a way that Russia has not had since, I don't know, probably the end of the Angolan Civil War, or sorry, I mean since the height of the Angolan Civil War, um, and then you can replicate that, and so now you have. I think it's just good for Russia as a state that considers itself an empire to have people in places called Bamako and Wagga waving Russian flags in the street. I kid you not, every roundabout in this entire city, every single one has a Russian flag, a Burkina flag, a Malian flag, and then for some reason that kind of escapes me, an Indian flag. Every single roundabout has those four flags out.
And how do they treat you when you're walking around?
Completely fine, honestly. Um, Part of my theory with that is that I kind of look like a soldier. Right now, I don't, just like given the haircut and clothes that I have here. Um, and my French is my French is good, but it's noticeably not French. So unless you're in like a really loud bar, you're gonna know that I have a different passport than a French passport. But like you literally when I got here and I had this guide that I was working with, I was like, okay, maybe we'll go here, maybe we'll go here. It was like almost like the first words out of his mouth. He was like, yeah, we probably can do that because you're not French. Like it's very much known that if you are French, there could be problems. Um, and
Interesting.
honestly, that kind of surprised me. I kind of thought that was overblown. And he was like, no, no, if you're French, like there's things you can't do. Um, as a matter of fact, I talked to another guide this morning about going outside of Wagga, and he was like, yeah, you know, even though you aren't French, you're still white, so it still might be a problem. But it's still like there's still definitely something very, very different about being French, um, that they all reference, that kind of surprised me.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about Russia having like a logistical base in Central African Republic and in Mali, kind of spreading out because they can fly drones from there. They can conduct air superiority. It makes me think of like Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti for the U.S., or I think they have a base in Niger also.
Yeah, and so we still have that base. It's in Agadesh, which is kind of surprising. So Niger was like the last big U.S. ally in the region, and big French ally, and there were a lot of French soldiers in Niger until December 22nd, and they left December 22nd. Um, but quietly, the U.S. airbase has remained in the north of Niger. Um, and nobody really wants to talk about it. Nobody really wants to mention it. Everybody just wants to keep that cool because the U.S. is not supposed to have military agreements with countries that have had coups. So we can't officially recognize that the Nigerian coup was a coup, and we don't recognize that. Uh, and the Nigerians don't give us trouble about the base, and everybody just shuts up. Very, we're just keeping quiet. But the French, like their embassy is closed, their soldiers are gone, and that's all happening. And that's all happening in real time. Like the
Wow.
French embassy, I don't know what day
Okay.
per se it was, but it was like in the last 3 weeks. Like the French embassy closed. They were smuggling food in through like trash cans because they couldn't. They were so surveilled, and there were so many people protesting outside that they couldn't like get supplies into the embassy. Um, the soldiers left the 22nd. So this is all kind of like happening as we speak. Niger has had this coup that got it was kind of the one nobody thought was going to happen because Niger was like always the big ally. It's always been super something they've always been super cooperative in the war on terror, and they were supposed to be this bastion of democracy. Um, but yeah, so that we had that drone base in Agadesh. But the thing about all this stuff is that it's just way more confusing than honestly they portray in the Times and the Wall Street Journal. And so like, when the Niger coup happened, there was all these stories about like Niger has been a bastion of democracy. It's one of the only countries in the Sahel that has had peaceful transitions of power. But like the guy they ousted did fraud to get in, and everybody knows it. It wasn't really a democratic election. And no one cares. Like you've experienced this with Kabila. Like when Joseph Kabila in Congo was kicked out of the presidency in Congo, there was an international conspiracy to basically say he lost this election. And I think there's a lot of reason. I'm not an expert on this stuff, but I think there's a lot of people out there who think that was not actually true, but they wanted him gone. And so as long as there's a Jeune Afrique thing that they said about Kabila, which was that like as long as you have a plausible fiction of an election, like the West will be happy. And but people get that. People understand that. And so in America, like we just hear these officials going, yeah, Niger was a bastion of democracy and they'd had this peaceful transition of power. So, it's such a tragedy that they had this coup. But actually in Niger, what's the difference? The one guy stole an election and then a different guy kicked him out. What's the diff? So it becomes very confusing once you get here because a lot of your presuppositions, a lot of things you thought you believed before you got here turn out not to be true. That's my experience. And I'm sure it's your experience too.
Yeah, I mean, in Congo, it was always so. I was there in 2011, and just to get in through Rwanda, I needed to bribe a border guard to let me in. I gave him my passport, and we brokered a deal where I could go in for 24 hours, and then I would give him coming out $100 US, and he would give me back the passport. And it was probably not the smartest thing to do, but
Wow.
whatever. It's sometimes you just do it because it was the only option. And I'm sure that
Yeah.
you've been in situations like that too, or you trust people just because you have a feeling about them and they will deliver on their promise. And I was lucky this time that a nice border officer was able to let me report on some elections in Congo that turned out to be a little bit violent. But yeah, I also,
Yeah.
that's a funny story because I
That
also,
so was that the election? Oh, sorry.
well,
Sorry.
I, I met someone from the UN in Rwanda as I was crossing. The border guy knew that I was a journalist, and he was like, "There's no way you're getting in." And someone from the UN noticed, and he was the one who really like helped me, kind of shepherd me across. And it's pretty funny because once I was able to do the whole thing and come back out. Um, we were playing, he lived in Rwanda. We were playing PlayStation 2 at his house, and I was ready to go back to the United States. And he was like, oh, like, it was so great meeting you. And I said, is there anything from the United States that you would want? And he's a Congolese guy. He had been to London, and he had this cross tattoo on his shoulder. And in 2011, no one had tattoos in Congo, but he was a really good artist, and he had been drawing. And he said, can you get me a tattoo gun? And
Wow.
I was like, yeah, I can get you a tattoo gun, sure. Um, and so I went back to the United States. I got a tattoo gun. I said, what address should I deliver this to? And he said, yeah, you can deliver it to my friend in Congo. He doesn't have an address, but here is his name. And uh, if you just write down his name, DHL, they'll find him. And that's the way that we've been delivering packages. I was like, are you sure? And he's like, yeah, don't worry. So I go to DHL. I have a tattoo gun. I give him 2,000 needles because I was like, I want you to be, safe with this. And then I write down, this guy's name in Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, Goma. Ship it off. It's like $250 to get it there. And then 3 weeks later, he sends me an email. He says, I got the tattoo gun. Thank you so much. And I was like, oh my God.
Wow.
Touchdown. Incredible.
Yeah, that's amazing. You know, you can actually do that. You can do that in Ireland too. You can be like, like you can send it to, your friend Marty, whatever, and just be like, it's the wee house on the corner there, like in, next to whatever bar, the Beehive. They'll figure it out. I love that stuff. You can do that with the Irish Post.
I love
Um,
that. It's incredible. It's
like
like they
just
go door to door and
yeah,
like ask if they know this person, and then they follow the path until they find them. It's amazing.
yeah. Um, that's super cool. So was that the election that I'm like now losing my thread of time. 2011 was the one Kabila was reelected in,
Yeah, he was. It was
and then
it was
he
against
okay, and then he was
Sisekedi.
who is now president, who just got
Yeah,
reelected.
but the
Who I saw. Okay, so actually, all right. So just to trade stories here, perhaps this is interesting. So as we talked about on the WhatsApp group,
oh,
I got in the
sorry.
car.
Actually, this was Etienne Tshisekedi, and I think the president now is
Yeah, yeah, the
Felix,
dad.
right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So Etienne. All right. So for people listening, this shit is like actually interesting. So Etienne was this like gadfly opposed first to the guy who became Joseph Mobutu, who had a hand in killing Patrice Lumumba. So Joseph Mobutu is like, he's the guy who's been involved in Congolese politics. He was like a colonel or something, like in 1960 when they get independence. You have Patrice Lumumba and who, along with Thomas Sankara here in Ouagadougou, are like the two murdered saints of like sovereigntist African left wing politics, and both for their own reasons are super super fucking cool. Um, Mobutu takes over with CIA backing, runs the country completely into the ground, doesn't pay his soldiers. Literally, my favorite Mobutu thing is that he told he gave a speech to the army once that said, "Why do you need a salary? You already have a gun." With the implication to just go rob and pillage and whatever. So Etienne Tshisekedi was this like kind of like the loyal opposition, the one tacitly approved opposing figure to Mobutu for like forever. Um, Starting I think in like the 70s, and not to go out into this, but just to show how all this nothing is new under the sun and how all this connects. Like the Tutsis, long established both on the Rwandan side of the border and then more controversially on the Congolese side of the border as people who came in like the early 1800s, I think, who are taller, who have fairer skin, who have hooked noses, and who graze cattle instead of being landed agriculturalists. Like the Tutsis have always been, a kind of marginal problem in Eastern Congo. They link up with Laurent Kabila, who's an insignificant leftist rebel hanging out in Tanzania after the Rwandan genocide, and because basically the Tutsis are like, never again. We're just gonna, from now on, we're gonna be the Central African superpower. Fuck all of this. We're the bosses now. And Paul Kagame and this guy James Kabarebe, who's like the most successful African warlord slash, he's not a warlord, he's a literal general, but like the most genius African military mind of his time, like engineers this pretty short conquest of all of Congo by Kabila using Rwandese forces, gets there, and then you have riots in the streets because this guy Chekeshedi doesn't get to be the new president, even though he's been the opposant forever. Everyone becomes really racist against Rwandans because they're like, even though we hated Mobutu, we don't really like the Tutsis either. It sucks that this tiny little country conquered us. there suddenly are massacres of Tutsis. Kabila turns on Rwanda. There's another war, and so it's just like, and then now Chekisheti's son, because like now Chekisheti's son is now leading fraudulent elections in Congo and being like touted as this like new Mobuto dictator. And so like the whole thing just like keeps going in like ever sweeping cycles of history in ways that I find like actually kind of fascinating. Um but I just think Congolese politics is like the coolest thing, but also the most depressing thing you can ever follow. Uh
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always plagued by the fact that there's this massive jungle in the middle of the two biggest cities. It's like southeast is Goma, and then like northwest is Kinshasa, and then in between is like a ton of militias and like animals that will kill you, and a dangerous river, and there's like mining corporations, and there's just a lot of like just a lot of dangerous stuff in between. So to kind of
yeah.
to to link the two, there's just a lot of obstacles.
hmm And there's also there's just like something, I mean, post independence, or actually I should say post Cold War Congolese history and Central African history is just weirdly dominated by the fact that after the Rwandan genocide, the Rwandan regime became this like mini superpower. They're like, I'm trying to think of another country that like replicates what they do, but they're like, they're like the Mongols or something. They're just like one group of people who just like their military power extends far beyond the number of people they are and like the size of territory they initially control. It just makes no sense. And they're just really good at war, and they're really, really organizationally sophisticated, and none of their neighbors can do anything like it. And it just means that if you go against Rwanda, you're going to have problems, and that's happening now. The M23 in Eastern Congo is like back, and I don't know why. I don't know. I don't even know. I don't know enough about it right now to know what even the issue is. But every time there's an issue between Congo and Rwanda, all of a sudden there's going to be a rebellion in Congo,
Hmm.
and Rwanda's going to say we have nothing to do with it, and you're going to know they do. You know, and there, there's some nations and peoples that like exist outside of history in certain ways where they're just better at war than other people, and it makes problems.
Yeah, I mean, Rwanda has an interesting situation right now with Kagame, right? Because I mean, it seemed like the international community was supporting him for a long time, and now it seems like he's not really in favor as much.
See, I would push back on that though. That's kind of why I think these. I, I think I guess that's what I mean is like they've become the indispensable nation. Like there's a long, so for France there was a long, long, long history of kind of being allied with the pre-Kagame military. And we can go into that. You know, it's a very sordid history that involves, you know, people probably remember Jacques Chirac, and like that whole Gaullist party was always kind of hooked up with them, the Hutu side of things. And so you had for a long time this really intense kind of suspicion between the new Tutsi regime and Kagame and successive French governments. Um, and then slowly you started to have an so Kagame. I mean, this is stuff that people like would never even think about because we don't even pay attention to this little stuff. But it was a huge deal in Africa. So Kagame left the international francophone organization, La Francophonie, and he joined the British Commonwealth, which is like a why would you do that? It's an organization for former British colonies, and a lot of people leave it. But it was a big fuck you to the French. And the British were super happy to have this. That was fun. All of a sudden, Rwanda now plays at the Commonwealth Games instead of the Francophonie Games, you know, the little mini Olympics and stuff. It was a big deal for people. Uh, that happened in 2008. By 2020, like, yeah, everybody was anti-Kagame. He was viewed as a tyrant. He did that thing of arresting Rubisinga, the guy who was in the Hotel Rwanda
Right.
movie, which is a big international scandal. And then all of a sudden, people realized that didn't work. And so Emmanuel Macron uh, pushed very hard for a Kagame ally to become head of the Francophonie. Um, a push that actually didn't work and was seen as too cynical and seen as basically sucking up to Kagame. Um, but that was coming directly from the French presidency. Um, Britain now is trying to send refugees because it's not going to happen, but they're trying to appease the right by making a scheme where they house people who arrive and apply for asylum. They house them in Rwanda and pay Rwanda a lot of money to do that. So they have to have Kagame on
Right.
board. And so now Rishi Sunak is like just like lavishes praise on how successful a country Rwanda is, like in public all the time, because otherwise it seems like I'm sending him to a third world hellhole. And so he's like, no, 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 Rwanda is the best country. And you see, just like Dubai, like I forget which soccer team it is, but if you follow English football, like it's or soccer, it's all you always see Fly Rwanda, Air Rwanda. It's a big airline. Is it Arsenal? I forget who it is, but anyway, um, there that whole thing, like I think people just gave up on being mad at him for being a dictator, which is fascinating to see. Um,
Yeah, I forgot about that. The refugee relocation program that the UK was going through with. That's always so. It's
it's
always
one of the
so
most,
interesting.
yeah, it's one of the most embarrassing. Not to leave aside the immigration politics of it, just like once you've reached a level of state capacity where you're going through such a convoluted scheme to house refugees or deport, like you can't effectively house refugees, intake them, or deport them and reject them and police them from your borders. Like it's embarrassing from every direction, left or right, pro refugee, anti-immigrant, however you want to call it. It's embarrassing. It's one of the craziest things I've ever seen in my life, in my opinion.
Um, oh man, it's very fun catching up with you on deep African politics because I haven't uh, I haven't talked about this in a while. And it seems like you were in Mauritania 11 years ago, and now you've recently come back to the region, right?
So yeah, so it's actually embarrassingly. So I'm 37 now. I Yeah, all right. Now we can stop talking about inside African baseball. But so like I got my start as like whatever, because I was at McGill in Montreal and I really didn't like it. I really didn't like college, and so I dropped out and rode freight trains around the country for a while. Um, but I had gotten really into basically French stuff. I got really into all this stuff we're talking about, like the francophonie, the wider French speaking world. Like just if you're in Montreal, like it's very present in your life because Montreal's not Quebec's not big enough to be its own thing. It has to conceive of itself as part of a larger francophone world, but I did really like Quebec. So anyway, I spoke French and I had like street smarts because I was like living on the streets and hitchhiking and train hopping and stuff. And so I got a job in Mauritania for a company where I was doing logistics for them. Uh, and we had three planes and a contract with the government and with Rio Tinto, which is the world's like most evil mining company, um, like an Anglo-Australian multi billion dollar company, that runs some of the biggest mines in the world. Uh, and so it was a good lesson in like life's compromises and life's difficulties because I was making what seemed like to me an unimaginable amount of money, which is $250 a day, and not paying rent. And I was there for a year. And Zurat, the town where I was at, there's no like paved road to get there. There is now, but there wasn't then. And so you would drive across the desert, and this insurgency that we were talking about in Mali, it actually kind of kicked off in Mauritania and then was quickly driven out. Um, and so there were like French people getting beheaded. My hotel got shot up in Nouakchott. So one day I was driving across the desert, and we stopped for the night in one town, and then the next day we got in there. We had no cell phones or anything, so we get to town and go to the hotel, and there's shrapnel in the courtyard, and like all these cars have been shot up, and like there had been an Al Qaeda attack at the hotel the night I was supposed to get there.
Damn.
I missed it, and that was well. It's so funny you say that, because this is why you have, like, if you have this kind of brain, you have to become a journalist. I was furious. I was like, I fucking missed it. I was so mad. And I know that that's a stupid reaction, but if you have that reaction, like, it is a good one. It is one that will animate your work if you are a journalist, of course, right? Um, and so anyway, and so then, but like more interestingly than the danger stuff, which was not super super crazy, but interesting. It was like I had 12 people who I worked with and a budget, 12 locals like that I paid, and I had to fire people and scream at people and act like real big boss. Everybody called me big boss.
And you're
Like
doing this in
21
French?
white kid. Yeah, in French, but they would say big boss translates across every language. um, and when people stole things, like I had to scream at them, and I had to, because I got, largely by default of anyone else who wanted to do the job, I got elected chief of the crew for the demobilization. And so I was in charge of, like, at that point, like, negotiating for hangars at the airport so we could put our planes there, and like setting wake up times for the older guys, and like handling all the money. So I would have like bricks of $40,000 in local currency, which is, back then they've slashed a digit off the currency now, but back then it was like that was a briefcase. So you would just have that um, just on you, and I had to deliver the data set of our geophysical mapping that we were making to the Rio Tinto offices. And like even then I knew enough about Rio Tinto to just be like, wow, this could really just like cause untold human and environmental misery. Like this, I'm giving the worst company in the world like access to go and like open huge pits of destruction
And a briefcase
on
full of money.
like yeah, it's just like it really, I honestly thought about like destroying the data set, which of course is just like, okay, someone hits download. It was literally a burned CD that I wrapped in printer paper and tied with Scotch tape, and that was $7.5 million worth of data that their cost for that CD was
And
7.5
so
million
what
dollars.
exactly was on the
And
CD?
the funny thing is, I told you earlier, and I choose to believe this because it's the best version of the story. I choose to believe that it was like gold, we found gold. Uh, the more realistic version is that what we were doing is basically flying planes really low over the desert and bouncing signals to do geophysical readings. So way back in the day, or actually not even way back in the day, back in the start of geophysics, as a component of mining, um, you had basically 25-year-old Canadian boys who went up onto the Canadian Shield carrying backpacks with magnetometers and gravimeters, and so they're looking by foot essentially for anomalies where that magnetometer says like, hey, it's way more dense in this spot than another spot, and the magnetometer will say, oh, hey, there's way more magnetic activity, which would indicate in general iron. And then then somebody else comes and does samples, and they drill and they see what's there, and then you go from there. So it's like multiple sections of mine discovery. Over time, people got better at it, and obviously it's radically more efficient to do this with a plane.
Yeah, do they use LiDAR
So
now?
I don't know, honestly. I don't think so. Um, because all this stuff is proprietary. There's only like 5 companies in the world that like do this stuff, like that really really focus on it.
Hmm.
Um, and there's like one that's like way bigger that is called Fugro. It's a I think a Dutch company, and then I think the second or third biggest was us. I'm not going to say the name so I don't get like sued for libel. Um, but they, they, you really do. So you have these fantastically, in the same way that everything now is like all our tech now is like shitty and it's just like an iPhone, but it's a radically magical, amazing device or whatever. I hate it, but it's a radically sophisticated device where everything's like really small and impossible for you or I to understand. This stuff is more like NASA, where it's like they have these huge cases that weigh 300 pounds with dials and buttons that light up, and it looks like the space age, but it's also like not possible to replicate. It looks like looking at a Boeing control panel. Um, it's like older tech, but higher tech. Does that make
Hmm.
sense? And each one of those is worth like $2 million. And so like to ship to like ship them out in like boxes that I had like Mauritanians build out of wood. It's like you're signing the insurance paper and it's like, okay, $2 million, blah blah blah. And then you're just like looking and you're like, oh, that's the crate we're shipping it in. Uh-oh. Um, but uh
What a
yeah,
wild
so it was
experience! What
it's
a insane experience!
yeah, like it was my military essentially. Like I probably should have joined the military just for the life experience and the discipline and things that it gives you, but this was my version of that where you like I came back an adult that I hadn't been before in certain ways, and I'm obviously very grateful for it. Um because I think it just made my life like way easier to have dealt with that for a year. Like nothing surprised me after that. Because it was like you did that year where everything surprised you and everything was hard, and then the rest of stuff now you're just like, okay, right. People live in much worse ways than I live, and things are much harder in a lot of ways, in a lot of places than they are for me in America.
Yeah,
Okay. Um,
I find that as well when you go through something that's just completely different than anything you could experience in I don't know, a metropolitan city in America. It's like all things considered to that experience, like, is it really so bad? Like,
right.
it's really,
And I
yeah.
think, I mean, I think there is like an argument, like, I mean, now we're talking like philosophy or something, but it's important. Like, I think there's a way of looking at life in America, like the psychic burdens of living in life in America and technologized society where there's so much insecurity, where, weirdly, like, however poor you are in Mauritania, it's a hell of a lot easier to raise kids and have a family there than it is in Chicago.
Totally,
Um,
totally. I don't think I really articulated it well. It's just such a different experience. It's not necessarily like harder. I think it's just such a different one.
right. And so I'm not articulating well, but I'm agreeing with you where it's like there's an argument that like we actually don't appreciate how hard America is to live in. Like we actually don't. I think there are a lot of people out there who don't appreciate how hard the first world actually
Hmm.
is to live in. Um, but like you also the challenges of living in the not first world and having like sort of omnipresent physical danger around you and having to like solve problems that you didn't know existed before. Like it just makes living in that world where the problems you already understood maybe suck, but like you grew up with them as context, it makes those a lot easier and a lot easier to manage.
Yeah, I kind of want to shift gears here a little bit because before we were talking about potential uprising during the 2024 election, and you mentioned that you had been kind of embedding and reporting a little bit on what's going on in America. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, no, you anticipated exactly the other thing I was trying to say there, which is like it's not necessarily. I mean, put it this way. I don't know. I would have to look at the figures, but like I think it's entirely plausible that life in America is more violent and dangerous than life in Burkina Faso, a hypothetically war-torn country right now. You know, um, just because we do have guns and we have murders that they don't have on a daily basis. Um, but yeah, so I got my start um, really doing long form reporting, like just following up from what we were just talking about. Like I kind of had this background because I'd worked in resources. Like a lot of the early stuff with when people talk about American Civil War, American militias, American right wing extremism, a lot of the early stuff that started popping up with that had to do with resource conflicts. It had to do with ranchers. It had to do with miners. It had to do with loggers. And this is especially back in the West. Uh, and so in 2015, I went to 2015. So in 2014, everybody's heard about this. In 2014, Cliven Bundy had his standoff at the ranch, where the federal government was trying to seize his cattle. And long story short, he brought a lot of armed guys to the ranch, and they had a standoff with the federal government, and he won. He got his cattle back, and nothing ever happened to him. In 2015, there was another standoff that was like the big original thing for the Oath Keepers, who everybody knows about now from January 6th, where Stuart Rhodes, who's now in prison for insurrection, um, and a bunch of other major Oath Keepers figures came and linked up with a gold mine, with a pair of like small time gold miners in Oregon, in Southern Oregon, and had a standoff with the BLM that was over issues that are so confusing that I can't go into them because I don't even remember them honestly. Um, but it kind of blew my mind because there was like 300 guys. They dug foxholes. They had belt loaded guns. I mean, this wasn't just ARs. They had belt loaded guns. They had dozers. They were blocking federal roads and stuff. It was a big deal, and it was a trial run. It was a trial run for how this stuff might work in the future. Um, and so I got a kind of picture of that stuff before maybe it became as much of a like, I mean, basically before Trump.
Hmm.
So after Trump, everybody was like, Nazis are going to march to the Capitol any day now. Like this is America now. I was in that world a little bit earlier, and so then when again like another kind of trial run of this popped off where Ammon Bundy, people will probably remember, seized control of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in Oregon. Um, I was I went there and I wrote a book about that, and that became a big part of my life. And it became kind of like the kind of thing that animated my work for the next nearly a decade now. Uh, just because the question of like the American Civil War, I tend to think that not that it's like literally inevitable, but like the conditions of distrust and basically like the conditions of living in separate nations that mentally speaking that create civil wars are already present in the United States. Um, and there's a really good book called The Confederate Nation uh, that describes the kind of emergence of like the Confederate mindset before the before 1861. And you can't read that book, or another great one is this book called The Impending Crisis, by someone whose name is escaping me now. You can't read those books and like read how they present a situation in which people started to have diverging conceptions of who they were, um, without I think coming to the conclusion that we're very much living through the same process. And Twitter's great for that because you can really see. I mean, Twitter's horrible for that because it's what's creating that, but it's also great because you can just see it in real time happening day by day, the diversions. Um, and so I think for me, the starting point was different for other people because I felt like I was really comfortable with the redneck side of things and with really comfortable with those guys and really honestly kind of interested in why they were so alienated and angry and things like that. It was always really easy for me to talk to them, and that meant in a kind of less fun way, it was always also always really easy for me to be a bit of an alarmist because I felt like I saw where things were going. And I feel like we, not to toot my own horn, but I feel like it has been largely borne out. Um, like I feel like my book now it's really funny because people buy the used version of it a lot now. It didn't sell well, didn't do well, and I think partly because it was really dire. It was very much like predicting like American chaos and stuff, and
What's the name of the book?
now it's like come to it's called Chosen Country: A Rebellion in the West. Um, and the last paragraph of it is basically predicting the stuff that we're talking about now, and people thought it was fucking crazy, honestly. And now if anything, like it's too measured. Um, and so I live so to give better because I'm talking like kind of theoretically here to give a better example. So I'm working on a book now about this area called the state of Jefferson, which is in far northern California. Uh, it's kind of like the northern third of the state where the population thins out. People talk about Northern California as being the Bay. The Bay is the middle of California. There's still a whole northern half of California where nobody fucking lives and where the life is just very different. And the reason that I find it really compelling and interesting is partially just because I like the lifestyle up there. It's very outlaw. It's very nature based. Everyone lives. It's an outdoor way of life. People live off the land in various ways, whether that's growing weed or logging or being a ski guide. Whatever you do, you live in some engagement with the
Hmm.
land. There's not a lot of cops. Is a lot of violence. So like you have to have a certain personality type to like that stuff because you are going to have to deal with certain people in certain ways and things like that. And you're going to have to. You don't really have a choice about that. And you have to drive everywhere. It's very American essentially. It's not what you think of as California. It's high elevation, extremely rural. The county where I've been living has one stoplight, literally in the whole county, um, and only 14,000 people. And it's like the size of Delaware. Um, and the thing about it, the reason I'm saying this is so in this area, the biggest county is Shasta County, and that is completely run by proxies of a militia, of a right-wing militia. They ran their candidates, they won. Um, they took majority control, and they are essentially doing. You mentioned Curtis Yarvin at the beginning. They're essentially doing a Yarvinite coup. They're basically purging the county government. They're firing everybody. They're putting in their people. They're doing countywide revolution, and they're trying to export this to other counties. And it's just and I know all these people. I see them at the rodeo. I see them at the bar. I'm friends with them. I have all their numbers in my phone. We text. I'm not. I know that people think this is weird, but I don't think these people are evil. I don't like work with them, but I talk to them. I hang out with them. You couldn't not hang out with them to some degree if you live up there. Uh, but like they're revolutionaries. They're trying to export this stuff to other counties, and if they and like also like their politics are backed up by the gun. I mean, they're the Irish Republican Army. There is no such thing as them winning control of this county government if they didn't have a militia. That just wouldn't have happened. It's the people who make their leg work. It's the people who, to some degree, they have made threats about especially during COVID, they said like, if you make us wear a mask to Walmart, like we're gonna fucking kill people. And the state and federal government said, not officially, but unofficially, okay, fine, that's cool. All right, we get it. You guys do your thing. Um, and they're engaged in armed politics. It's not civil war, it's not revolution, but it is armed politics because what they're doing, it doesn't work unless they have an army behind them. Um, and they've driven people out of politics with death threats. Like they're serious people. They're revolutionary people, and that's just the county that I happen to know. This is a lot of this stuff happens, and you don't even hear about it.
Yeah, I've heard about other instances
Throughout
in
the country.
Montana and the Dakotas as well. And it kind of is flying under the radar, but it's when you look at how many guns there are in America, I mean, I think it's more than people at this point. Um, if you do the math, it's there.
Oh yeah, 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 a lot more. I think it's a lot more.
Yeah, over 400 million. If I had to, I think that was the number. But yeah, I mean, if you do the math,
Yeah, yeah.
it's really it really leads to a place of armed rebellion. Um, but that in California, I think you wouldn't really expect it as much as that because it's a blue state. I think you would expect it much more.
Well, I would push back on that just because in California, like California feels like particularly where it will happen because in California you have the interface between the globalist liberal elite and the populist Republican thing. You actually have there's a line
Hmm.
that you can cross where there's one, but there's a government that actually like impinges on these people's lives, right? Whereas in Texas, like you can go to Greg Abbott and yeah, it's bad. Republic. I don't think any of this stuff actually has to do with Republican versus Democrat. It has to do with the functioning of the American empire. It has to do with how we structure our monetary systems. It has to do with how we structure social liberalism and technology in our lives. Like this is the stuff that actually people are going to fight over. It's not like I don't think Greg Abbott as governor of Texas is like really on the side of the people who are really really alienated by this system we live in, and that's certainly not the case in California. But in the sense that we're talking here, like I feel like blue states very much are the place where there's potential for violence because you have to get control of your county in order to resist Sacramento in California. In Texas, you have agency in the
Yeah,
state
that's a good
house.
point.
So it's a little different.
What are some other
Um,
uh, uh, I don't know, armed counties in blue states that have you come across any others?
well, I mean, the sleeper one is like the sleeper one is going to be like based upstate New York for sure. I think.
I
Um,
mean, upstate New York is just it's so wild. Why are there so many cults there? You've got like Falun Gong, you've got Nexium. It's
yeah,
like there are just so many weird enclaves of like belief systems that are completely unique and cloistered.
it's cheap. I think that's a big part of it. And it's cheap in it. It's cheap in it. There's just a lot of land there. Like it's not upstate New York is huge, and the population density is really low. And I think the Northeast, I mean Maine, all this stuff. I'm not trying to call out counties as being like rebels here, like, but again, I think that like the kind of blue versus red state idea that people have for like how this stuff is going to play out just actually doesn't have anything to do with what the real divisions are. The real divisions are like how and for whom have we structured this economy? And right now we've structured it for I'm going to get myself in trouble here, but we've structured it for basically a parasitic class of not the 1%, but of the 15% who can sort of leech off non-productive managerial jobs. I think that's you can call that a right-wing thing, but it's just mathematically true. And like there's a lot of people who are really mad about that, and those people who have that leech power have a lot of investment in maintaining that power, and they have a lot of investment in not understanding why so much of the world doesn't like them. And so they cling to this worldview that they have that's reinforced by the New York Times and CNN, and it's fine. Perhaps I'm one of those leech people too. I live in the culture of those leech people. I'm implicating myself here, but like it behooves you to at least understand why people have the problem, because if you don't, you're going to be in trouble. And if you think that it's just like crazy rednecks like in some faraway state who are mad at you, that's just not true. Like it's the people who live like two counties over for you. Like, and that's as true in Maryland. I mean, look at Western Maryland. Like it's probably more conservative than half of Texas, you know? Um, I don't know that there is like a red and blue America that you could draw, except on a very, you're having to take such a fine comb that it starts to be impossible unless you're a real expert in American geography. You're not you're not looking at a north versus south thing. The my thing is my other so another way of talking about this. Sorry, this is a long answer, but like Jamel Bowie, who I do think is smart, even though I don't agree with him on anything he's ever written. Um, he had a good piece in the New York Times that I actually quoted, where he was arguing that there's no chance of American Civil War because the American Civil War was fundamentally based on two sets of elites having divergent economic interests, where essentially like actually the industrial North really needed to not be following the macroeconomic policy that the South wanted, and vice versa. And eventually, you had a separation of societies based on actually like how you're going to fill your bellies and your coffers and things like that. And he was saying that doesn't exist in America now. It's just cultural differences, so this doesn't matter. And the reason that I think that that's a really dangerous way to think is that it misses that actually precisely the argument that people on the right make for needing to basically engage in, as Patrick Deneen says, Patrick Deneen, a political science professor at Notre Dame, says like we need regime change now. And the reason they say that is they say that 15% of kind of parasitic managerial elites are exactly the people who represent an entrenched economic bloc that must be resisted by force or by extreme political force. Let's not necessarily say they have to be killed, but that have to be resisted by political overthrow. Actually, conservatives already have the Confederate worldview that their economic future is incompatible with the economic future as pursued by liberals. And I think liberals don't understand that. It seems like a very dangerous situation. Like just even it would help, even if you disagree, like it would help to understand the argument against you so you could respond to it. And I don't think people are open to that.
I mean, there's a lot to think about there.
So the conservative argument would be that cultural power in America, cultural and political power in America, has actually become a means of maintaining economic power. And so, you know, the quote unquote expert class in this country and the journalistic class and the class of people who have master's degrees and above have increasingly become alienated from what might be thought of as a broad, both like left and right wing kind of populist ferment saying that everything in the country sucks. Um, that seems to be growing like quite in spite of like traditional markers. So, for example, like GDP is growing a lot, but average Americans think the economy is shit. And you have this kind of like, it's a good example of this. You have this kind of like journalistic and academic kind of arched eyebrow response to that by saying, well, no, 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 you guys are wrong. The economy is great. Look at the job figures, look at GDP numbers, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And the conservative argument would essentially be that these people are using false, not false figures, but figures that don't actually reflect like what people want out of life, which might not actually be like number goes up all the time. Um, they are using false markers like what the good life is. So particularly conservatives, but conservatives would not be the only people doing this. Like Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy makes this argument that like actually people tend to be happier when they are married, have kids, have strong societal bonds, have strong national identities, things like that. And yet, like, somehow, if you talk about that, it feels very like right wing right now. And frequently, when you talk about that, the conservative argument would be that you are you are pushing a sort of like fascist family based nationalism over the liberal free loving values that have formed the America as we know it today. And the conservative argument is essentially that the people who really benefit from this, the people who really benefit from like the breaking of, American social norms, or like a world in which people have way fewer kids and have probably looser family ties and spend a lot more time on their iPhones, are essentially like tech companies, people who can siphon money off of an ever expanding government, et cetera, et cetera. Some of this is inconsistent. I'm having trouble recreating it entirely because sometimes there's going to be different people saying different things, and sometimes the argument doesn't always make sense.
Yeah, no, I think I'm getting it now. It's like we have like the professional managerial class that's able to make extra income that they can invest in the stock market. And when we see the economy is going up, it's like really only the people that are able to invest in the stock market that can see the benefits. But when you have a fully like renter class that is living paycheck by paycheck, and we see like, oh, there are like all these jobs being created, but it's really people working two jobs because they need to pay for the things that they were able to pay for 5 years ago. It doesn't really give an accurate reflection of where we are.
Right. And like, so, and then the conservative argument would be essentially that social liberalism, the ideology that things are always getting better all the time, has become so dominant in the worldview of basically the people who run Western societies, that if you criticize the role of technology in our lives, if you criticize the idea that GDP always going up might not be the best way to define what a good life looks like, things like that, you are calculated as you are colored as reactionary. And so their argument is essentially that liberal culture has become a tool of the people who want to financialize and turn everything in human life into a kind of financial game, and remove our fundamental sort of like human values and traditional American values and things like this. They view this as all part of the one project that is progressivism. And you can't separate the financialization from the cultural power of progressives in universities, etc. To them, this is all one thing. And that essentially what I'm describing to you, to use a term from the internet, I'm giving a picture of what the red pill is. Once you see this as a system, once you see this as a system that is underpinned by a false idea, a false worship of the concept of progress, you are red pilled, and then everything makes sense, right? And it all fits in the same story. But that's basically like a lot of people now. That doesn't. This worldview is, I would say, increasingly dominant on the right, but it's not the worldview of your average Republican office holder. They would have no idea what the fuck I was talking about. So what you're witnessing in Republican circles now, when you see Matt Gaetz unseating Kevin McCarthy, behind the scenes, because they can't talk about this shit in public, but behind the scenes, what you're seeing, like I talked about this with Steve Bannon while it was happening, and he was like, yeah, this is so annoying because they won't just come out and say what the fight is about. And I actually agree with that. that like what Gates is doing is sort of pushing for a wider role for the red-pilled right and pushing out this other Republican guard, but to come out and explain the worldview that would be current among Republicans of Gates's generation is not really possible yet. And so you had Blake Masters who ran to some degree on the worldview that I just tried to explain and lost. You had JD Vance who shares that worldview in large part, not in large part, completely, um, who won. But JD kind of ran more as just a traditional Trump Republican. Um, so you have a lot of stuff that's happening behind what people are necessarily showing on TV, and behind, frankly, like what liberal political commentators are capable of understanding. Um, because they're just not talking with these people and they're not immersed in their worldviews. Uh, and so this now we've done 20 minutes on this, but that's why I think it's dangerous. Is like when people look at the Republican Party and cry that it is dangerous, perhaps that is true, but whatever, even if it's not dangerous for the reasons you think it is. Like you think everybody's fucking crazy. What's actually happening is that they're playing you because they're doing a shadow game. Because it doesn't make sense to do this stuff on Fox News. You have to do it on Twitter. So that's, to me, the Civil War stuff is both really different than how a lot of people conceive of it as like this kind of angry MAGA horde that might emerge one day. But it's also more present because the divergence of worldviews is so extreme that I think at this point, like a lot of people can't even understand what has happened. If that makes
Yeah.
sense. I know this gets very
No, no,
complicated.
no. I think you paint a pretty accurate picture from the macro to the micro, going from uh, the legislature down to like the county level. I think that there's like a serious disconnect there, and once the trust is like eroded between the top and the bottom, I mean, this, but it's like that's when civil war happens, when there's just that, when the fabric of society is linked to the trust of like a government. When that erodes, you're going to have an uprising, and it seems like it seems like we're getting there. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you could even see. I know I just said don't look to Texas, but the other thing that I'm not talking about here is just the divergence of opinion on immigration is this is another Bannonism, and another thing that I think Bannon is fundamentally right about is that the reason, the one thing that separates the kind of Steve Bannon style right wing populism from left wing populism in terms of how they function, who they speak to, etc. The big thing is one question: it's immigration. And you and I might disagree with him about whether this is good or not, but I think he's correct that the reason the energy right now for this kind of rebellious feeling is on the right is because they are anti-immigration, and there's a swirling discontent about this stuff. I mean, we had 300,000 people enter the United States in December. That's
I
crazy.
mean,
It's a lot of
being in
people.
New York, it's
It's a lot.
like
It's unsustainable.
I pass like the Roosevelt Hotel, which is the intake center in New York, all the time, and there's a whole
Yeah.
economy that has sprouted up just around this hotel of people selling SIM cards and scooters, and it's just incredible to see. And I think New York is definitely uh, is is feeling it a lot more now than they did a year ago.
Yeah. I mean, just a side note, just because when I was in Mauritania, it's not a big country. The networks there are very close, and they there's a guy who named Pedro. He's literally one guy. He's moved 50,000 people from Mauritania to New York in the last few years. I didn't believe he was real,
Whoa.
so I had someone pull him up on Clubhouse. He's in Nicaragua. They all go to Nicaragua. Um, and but it's crazy because I started telling people in Mauritania what the figures for people arriving at the southern border were in December because when I was there in Mauritania, and I started telling the kids, I was like, "Do you really want to go? Look how many people came today." And they were like, "Oh, that is crazy." Like even the kids who want to go to America were like, "That's crazy. That's too many people." So something's going weird. But the thing I was going to say is like the stuff that to look at in terms of like quote unquote civil war uprising is probably not like some kind of organic like militia takes to the streets and fights the federal government. It's going to be stuff like where Texas seizes the park as they did 2 days ago. Like a federally managed park, Texas takes it over, and then you have somebody come and say, "No, no, 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 this is federal property," and you have a state, you have a state policeman say, "No, no, right now we took it over." And you have this kind of breakdown between federal and state
Yeah,
authority, or indeed, as in California happened, between state and county
totally
authority.
agree.
That's
Totally
where,
agree. And it could be as it could come down to like Trump being on the ballot.
yeah, 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 for sure, for sure. Somebody's gonna come and just say, no, 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 we're gonna let him. Yeah,
Hmm.
I definitely think that's a
Yeah.
possibility. Except if somebody says Trump can't be on a ballot, it, unless a federal court says that to a state, which fine, I don't think has happened and I don't think will happen. It's all happening at the same level. It's going to be your Secretary of State saying to your interior state officials that they can't do that. So maybe you would have a county rebellion, but I don't. It's not that like division of power that would cause a spontaneous rebellion there because you're all operating at the same level of government. Does that make sense? That's why I don't see the Trump on ballot stuff going anywhere. But maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, hard to say. It's I do agree that it would be states kind of like fortifying themselves, being like we don't agree with the national sentiment, but we have a local sentiment, so we're going to protect our people because we're not being protected by the greater nation.
Yeah, I I'm contradicting myself now. I think I agree with you. I'm not convinced that those states, it's going to be hard for those states as well. It's going to be, Texas is not Texas anymore. Texas as like, Texas could act in 1861 when they seceded from the Union and act as Texas as unified entity. I don't think that works anymore either. The level of dissent that you would see throughout, like internally within the state, would be really taxing for anything. So I don't think it's going to be I do think it's just always
Yeah.
going to be chaos. It's not going to be there's like a big
Oh,
block of rebel
totally.
territory. I don't think it's even
It's
possible
definitely
for
going to
that to
be
happen.
that.
Yeah.
It's definitely going to be chaos. It's like once the leadership falls, it's like there's a vacuum that usually if it's filled by an entity that is like much more draconian than the one before. Like if you look at Egypt, um, or even like, or it's not filled at all. If you look at like Libya, um, so it could very well just
Right.
be chaos.
But so this goes back to what we were talking about earlier. There's another version of this that's actually like that's actually really there's a version of this where you can actually just like get out of this problem. And it it's like by solving it's by using mass scale industrial policy to basically elevate things that both conservatives want and liberals tend to say they want in terms of family formation, an ownership society, blah blah blah. You can kind of unite the Bernie bro left and the populist right. Like the path to doing that is not that complicated actually. I'm doing a piece about this for the New York Times right now that's really late. But this guy Chris Murphy, and a lot of people on both right and left who talk about this concept of the realignment. which is a big thing in DC right now. Under the table, it's mostly young guys, it's all guys. Uh, it's political nerds in some ways, but centered around people who no longer regard right and left as meaningful political concepts, because essentially, like, the real question is like how you use the tools of the American empire, whether we retain those tools militarily speaking, whether we retain the dollar as this kind of like backstop to the economy that forces us to remain in debt at all times. This stuff gets super confusing, but long story short, like, do we have a bunch of like cheap money flowing into in an economy that backs up people who don't do any real stuff, or do you retarget that money at mass level industrial production, fundamentally at military production back here at home instead of abroad or non-existent? Uh, do you go to war with the banks? Um, there are things that you can actually do that would like solve this problem that probably a Democrat has to do, because if a Republican does it, for better or for worse, like I think a lot of liberals will regard it as fascism. Um, my outside take is that, yeah, like a kind of post neoliberal Democrat gets in 2028 and like saves the world. Like I actually think that's a possibility. Um, that's what I'm hoping for. Uh, and I think there are people who are thinking that way, and people have probably heard these names, but like Jake Sullivan is thinking that way. Um, Ro Khanna is thinking that way. Um, Jake Sullivan is the national security advisor. Ro Khanna is congressman from Palo Alto, Silicon Valley. Um, Chris Murphy is thinking that way. There are a lot of people who, and they are also thinking about ways to stitch culturally the country back together. Ro and I would say Jake Sullivan probably too are people who are very sympathetic to the culture of.
Uh-oh, I lost you.
Hold on, I just realized that my headphones died. I'm gonna get another pair and I'll be right back.
Okay, welcome back.
Thank you. I think we can just feed back into this. I was saying about the Ro Khannas and um, Jake Sullivan's and Chris Murphy's of the world, that they have they have a view that you can basically solve this problem by industrial policy, and that actually reinvigorating the political power, the financial power, essentially redirecting financial power towards productive industries, towards I built something with my hands, I produced something on this farm, reorienting the economic base of the American economy towards those things will, as it was in the glory years of industrial modern society, will empower the middle class more, will direct political power away from the industries that have captured a large portion of power over the federal government in recent years, whether those are financial, the weird little like kind of like NGO kind of like I do nothing lobbyist expert think tank class, whether it's, some people would say universities. I don't really agree with that one, but a lot of conservatives would say it's universities, whatever. It would direct it back towards people who actually like produce and need money. And the problem that I think a lot of the more revolutionary right wingers have with that idea is that it doesn't account for how wild our debt is. Um, and this is where it starts to get out of my realm of understanding, because it's like there are people who say that everything that we're talking about just doesn't matter anymore because America's debt is so extreme that if we have an economic downturn, we won't be able to service the interest on the debt. I People have been saying stuff about debt for a long time. America has kept printing money. A pyramid scheme works as long as everybody believes in the pyramid. And then this starts to get the downstream effects of this. I'm sorry if this is not interesting. Hopefully it is, but these are the conversations that
No,
are
I'm with
happening in
you.
Washington. It's super crazy because just no one will tell anyone in public what they're actually talking about. But like, okay, so maybe that's true, but the fact of the matter is that the reason America prints money and has the dollar, is the dollar backstop and settles 60% of foreign currency transactions in the world is fundamentally a military one. We got the guns. So you got to kind of do the stuff that we say, and there's a reason for this, and we can go into all of that and the euro dollar system. But okay, so maybe that breaks down, but maybe it doesn't because we reset our economy in this new industrially planned way that everyone talks about now and that Biden's already sort of theoretically started to do. But actually, maybe that doesn't work if America's military deterrence power as the world's preeminent kind of policeman stops working. So maybe actually all of this runs aground on the beachhead of the Houthis right now as we're talking. That's a lot of people are thinking right now. So like when you talk about civil war, are you talking about like a guy in Texas who's mad about like, I don't know, like about trans stuff, or are you talking about like the the gummed up mechanisms of empire causing the tank to sink into the sands of Yemen? Because that's like honestly the bigger problem here. And like,
Totally. I mean, I think like Ray Dalio has a lot to say about this, but
yeah,
basically, he has this whole system where the dollar will cease to be the reserve currency
right,
and it will go to China. But for that to happen, there needs to be a war to declare a new reserve currency. And throughout the history of capitalism, from the Dutch to the British, and now to America, that's been the pattern: is that there is a war. The winner of the war establishes the reserve currency. Then there's like a time of peace and prosperity where um, the reserve currency country is able to borrow a lot.
mm-hmm.
When they borrow, they're able to invest in entrepreneurship. With entrepreneurship, they're able to create new technology. The new technology helps expand the empire. And then once the empire is expanded, they overborrow.
Right,
There's more of a leisure class that gets a little bit lazy and they enjoy the finer things in life. And then a new power comes along that is able to take the technology that the reserve currency country invented, innovate it, make it more effective, cheaper, and expand their own empire. And then there is a war,
yeah,
and then a new reserve currency
yeah,
goes into effect. And whether that is a civil war in America or it is a global war, he predicts that it's going to be one of the two, and then the dollar is no longer going to be the reserve currency. And so over borrowing factors into that a lot.
yeah. And and so I have two things. I mean, so it's funny. So there's all these theorists of empire now. It's a real boom industry. Um, I would say everybody should get into it, but I feel like it's actually starting to be saturated already. Um, but like the OG of all of these people was Ibn Khaldun. He lived in Tunisia. He wrote this book called the Mukaddima, which a lot of people read in college history classes, and I've lugged with me across half of Africa now, because I want to use it in the piece that I'm writing about all this stuff. Um, and it's just shocking. I'm not saying Ray Dalio literally stole the Mukaddima, but he did literally steal the Mukaddima. Like everybody's recycling this thing because it is a natural pattern of history. I think that's just true. And in the Mukaddima, my favorite line is that there's a moment at which the people who come in and take over the empire, whatever the empire is going to be, he thinks of it as the center and the periphery, because he's writing from North Africa in, I don't know, 1100 AD. So he thinks of it as the nomads coming into the periphery, and they take over, which has been a big pattern for long pieces of history. And one of the moments he identifies for like when the empire is about to fall again and get taken over by harder, tougher, more badass people is when the elites start eating quote rich food, which I always laugh about. Um, but yeah, it's this is a conception of history that is floating around and that people have, Bannon uses the fourth turning thing, whatever. I haven't read it, but we're living through a fourth turning right now. There's just the meme, good men, strong men make good times make weak men, weak times, whatever. You know what I'm saying? Like there's the cyclical vision of hard people make good times, and then good times make weak people, and then you have bad times, and then those make hard people, and then it just goes on forever. Um, but the thing, the thing about this stuff and the kind of the reserve currencies, like, and the war, like, so one of the things, another thing that like people won't explain in public that is definitely happening right now is this kind of like like these kind of like based right wing NGO expert type people who have the ear of a lot of people in Washington on the right who are pushing for what for a way out of that Ray Dalio scenario where what you actually do is you provoke the war, and by provoking the war you reinvigorate the American sort of body politic as a unified entity. And a lot of people talk about Mexico. They're like, we're going to go to war with the cartels. And you'll see this. It's already happening. Like before, it was just behind closed doors. But now, like Dan Crenshaw, the guy with the eye patch, Congressman Texas.
Yeah.
Yeah, Dan Crenshaw talks about it publicly now. People talk about it publicly now. And people talk about, and it's happening. You'll see on the cover of the American Conservative, are a cover which I appeared on, by the way. So I can't, I mean, it wasn't my piece, but I'm not saying they're evil people, right? But the American Conservative is like, should the cartels be labeled a terrorist group? Which doesn't make any fucking sense. Um, that conversation has been bubbling up. And there are people who like, the problem with when you start playing with these conceptions of history and these historical metaphors, are we Rome, blah, 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 then you're like, well, the way to get out of being Rome is what we got to do is we got to invade something. Because it's like what Marcus, whatever the fuck, did in whatever the fuck. Like, people start making analogies that don't make any fucking sense, right? And like the Mexico stuff. I know I sound crazy, but I think we are closer to invading Mexico than you could possibly imagine. Because it doesn't for the United States military to act on the word of a president is just not that hard, and the conversation developing around that stuff behind closed doors is not a joke. And 3 years before the second invasion of Iraq, or the second Iraq War, it, the idea that we would just go in and topple Saddam Hussein because we felt like it would have seemed like a joke. Like it's just the line between maybe we should do this dumb thing to we'll do this dumb thing is not a long one. Um, and I don't want to name his name. But one of the people pushing this is, he's a wealthy guy who kind of does like political advising on the side, and he's very, very intelligent. Like, and if you start getting into these things, he's like, well, like actually the population of this thing is like, if you think about, he's very smart, but like on the macro level of like what we do to save this nation and bring it back together, I'm like, you could not possibly be more wrong that this would go well. This would not go well. And it really freaked me out. It really freaked me out. But there's a lot of people who listen to him and think he's a genius, Um, and so I know I sound like a conspiracy theorist, but like the conspiracies they're not even conspiracies. It's worse. It's just like a few guys like have an idea, and then they're all in DC and Berkeley and Palo Alto and Austin, and they get together, and eventually it becomes like a meme, and it's like, yeah, let's do this. I mean, it's not that different from how the Iraq War happened, and this is how politics actually does work in the United States. We are an oligarchy, and it's just the right wingers say we're an oligarchy run by this 15% of liberal professional managerial class people, but like they're also all the people who are say that are in that class as well, and like they have power too, and like it just there's just so much that happens behind the scenes in my this is my to continue my like stupid little life story that I had done here. After my militia phase, I just ended up, because I knew people on the right, I ended up in a lot of political conversations where I was in allowed into rooms that a lot of people aren't allowed into, and because I'm an interlocutor on both sides of these things, and because I can see in certain ways both sides of a lot of conversations in a way that might help my journalism, it also might make some people think that I'm like a coward who can't take a side. I've really, really come around to seeing American politics as like a really elite project where things are really downstream of stuff that elites decide and not the other way around. And I honestly didn't know that before. Um, it's been very interesting for me in the last few years.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely a lot of shadow play going on, um, and the strings are being pulled by uh, very few people.
But but not people who you think. I mean, yeah, yeah, there's the billionaire stuff. That's all real, but it's not, it's also like real that it's like a bunch of 32-year-old morons who went to Georgetown who just have an idea. Like that stuff is real too. And we talk a little less about that.
It's always funny when you see like a meme that started on 4chan as a like, let's see if this will catch fire, and then it does catch fire, and then people take it as reality, like the OK symbol. I
Yeah.
you know that started as like a joke on 4chan, like let's try and make this like a white nationalist symbol, and then it did catch fire, and then Call of Duty is removing it from video
Right.
games, and then like Jacques Cousteau, who has it's also the symbol in diving for AOK, because you can't
Oh,
talk when you're
yeah.
underwater. And Jacques Cousteau has a statue underwater in Guadeloupe in the Caribbean, and
Oh,
someone like
really?
sawed off his hand because
Oh my
they
God.
think that it is a like a white nationalist symbol, when it really only started as a meme on 4chan. It's like this this kind of memification that can explode and become a political movement, really.
Okay, but there is an inverse to that. Um, that I feel like now with this space of distance, like because I have defended a lot of these people, and I'm friends with a lot of people on the right, and a lot of people in this kind of dissident right space, where it's very edgy based politics. Like I'm not going to pretend I don't have a lot of friends in that world. I do, uh, but I would say in the last like 8 months, it has really shifted for me towards places that I'm just like not. I actually, if anything, I think that people overestimate the kind of racial nature of the Trump base and underestimate the kind of racial nature of the what is emerging as conservative kind of like educated elites. Um, and like especially in the Twitter sphere, like it, it's kind of like something happened after Musk. This shit is real, basically. I think it's after Elon Musk took over, like, and it was just legal to be racist again. Like, what happened was that you couldn't, if you were like, hey, like racism is bad, like so many people in your side of like dissidenty, I don't like the liberal mainstream kind of spaces on Twitter, the racist dogs were unleashed in that way, where now you would get piled on so much that you're just not going to say that. You're just not going to push back against racist stuff because it's too you'll get piled on too quickly. And it drove everybody in the same way that the left went crazy during Trump, where it was like if you said one thing like maybe Hillary Clinton wasn't a great candidate, like you wouldn't want to say that because you would get piled on. Now the same thing is happening on the right, and it's like driving an extremism thing that I actually think is legitimately just real. Um, and like it does make me kind of uncomfortable. Um, kind of uncomfortable is underplaying it, but it's something that I think creates a huge difficulty because for so long we've been living through kind of like crazy online overreactions from essentially like centrist liberals, because that was the governing thing that controlled Twitter. It was the governing worldview, and now the governing worldview is like anti, like the governing worldview is just now the governing worldview. Sorry, there's a plane flying over right now. It's actually a Chinook helicopter, interestingly enough. So that's probably, we can talk about it, but that's probably military. That's not from here. Um, but the governing worldview now is an Elon Musk who quite genuinely believes in things like, that mass immigration is a plot to change the voting patterns of America by importing immigrants. Like he genuinely believes that cultural change is driven from the top by organizations like the World Economic Forum. Like, and he that's gonna be the governing thing. Um, in a lot of discourse, that's gonna rise to the level of discourse where it's almost equal and opposite to what we once understood as the mainstream before too long. I think underestimating Twitter as a digital commons, or sorry, as a space where norms are established would be very foolish. I think it is still the space where you create the baseline for conversations, and now it is just a completely different place than it was 6 months ago. Um, so I would be curious. Within within another 6 months, you are going to see a right that is much more coalesced around this kind of red pilled anti-globalist thing than even it was kind of at the height of the Trump era. And it's going to be much more easy to explain this stuff to the average Fox News viewer. It's going to come. It's going to come into the real mainstream now. Is my impression.
It's definitely possible. It seems to be going that way. People are coming out of their deep forests, if you will. I think we're at the 2-hour mark.
Yeah, that's probably good.
Maybe
Yeah, we don't want to lose people.
But James, it was so good to talk to you. Holy shit. Thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, of course.
To chat from Burkina Faso, and stay safe out there, man.
Thank you. I think I'm going to get out of here in a couple days and go to France and write my piece. So hopefully everything, inshallah, everything works out in the next couple days, and then I'll be good. But this was a lot of fun. I was I like all these topics, and it's always fun to get to talk Africa.
For sure. We can do a part 2 later on if you want.
Yeah, I would love that. Well, thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Right on.